My 7-year-old daughter spent months practicing to be the flower girl until my own mother called and told me she'd been replaced. Not because she did anything wrong. Someone offered $10,000, and suddenly, my child no longer belonged in the wedding. What they didn't expect was that the truth would come out in front of every guest, and the person who paid for control would lose far more than money. If you enjoy emotional family stories filled with shocking twists and satisfying karma, make sure to subscribe, because this story is one you won't forget. Have you ever watched your child lose something they never deserved to lose? Not because they made a mistake, but because an adult decided money mattered more than promises?
I have.
My name is Mira Zhang, and this is the story of how my 7-year-old daughter was removed from my sister's wedding after someone offered $10,000 for another child to take her place. What happened afterward changed my family forever. My name is Mira Zhang. I'm 34 years old, and I live in Portland, Oregon. I work as an elementary school counselor, spending every weekday helping children solve problems that often begin with adults making poor decisions. Life has taught me to stay calm during conflict, but nothing prepared me for the betrayal that came from my own family. I'm also a widow. 5 years ago, my husband passed away unexpectedly, leaving me to raise our daughter, Hannah, on my own. She is 7 years old, thoughtful beyond her age, and the kind of child who thanks grocery store cashiers without being reminded. She notices when people are lonely, remembers birthdays without writing them down, and believes every promise should be kept. Looking back now, I wish the adults around her had believed the same thing. My younger sister, Emily, had always been the adventurous one in our family. She loved traveling, trying new careers, and making spontaneous decisions. Even though our personalities were different, we stayed close throughout adulthood. When she announced her engagement to Daniel Brooks almost a year earlier, I couldn't have been happier for her. Daniel was kind, patient, and impossible to dislike. He treated Emily with genuine respect, and he quickly became part of our family. Several months later, Emily invited Hannah to become her flower girl. I still remember that afternoon. It was a warm Saturday in early spring. We were sitting in Emily's backyard after lunch while Hannah chased bubbles across the grass. Emily walked over carrying a small white gift box tied with a satin ribbon. She knelt beside Hannah and smiled. "Hannah," she asked softly, "would you help me on my wedding day by being my flower girl?" Hannah looked at me before answering, almost as if she wanted permission to be excited. When I nodded, she threw her arms around Emily so tightly that both of them nearly fell backward into the lawn chairs. It became one of those family moments everyone pulled out their phones to record. For weeks afterward, Hannah practiced her flower girl walk everywhere. She practiced in our hallway. She practiced in the backyard. She practiced inside the grocery store until I reminded her that shopping carts were not wedding aisles. Every evening, she carefully arranged silk flower petals into tiny baskets, pretending invisible guests were watching her. She even asked me one night if flower girls were allowed to smile too much. I laughed and told her there was no such thing. Those memories still hurt because they were real. The excitement wasn't temporary. It became part of our daily routine. About 2 months before the wedding, Emily took Hannah shopping for her dress. The boutique overlooked downtown Portland, filled with soft lighting, polished wooden floors, and rows of elegant children's formal wear. Hannah tried on 3 different dresses before choosing a simple ivory gown with tiny embroidered flowers around the waist. When she stepped in front of the mirror, Emily wiped away tears. "You look perfect," she whispered. The saleswoman smiled. "So," she asked Hannah, "are you excited?" Hannah answered without hesitation. "This is the biggest job anyone has ever trusted me with." Everyone laughed. At the time, none of us realized how heartbreaking those words would eventually become. As summer approached, wedding planning became more stressful. Emily called almost every evening. Sometimes she wanted opinions about centerpieces. Other times she worried about guest seating or catering changes. Whenever she sounded overwhelmed, I reminded her that weddings were only one day. Marriage was the part that actually mattered. She always agreed. At least she used to. Then something changed. At first it was subtle. Emily became harder to reach. Phone calls grew shorter. Text messages became delayed. Whenever I asked about final wedding plans, she sounded distracted. Daniel still answered politely whenever we spoke, but even he seemed unusually tense. I assumed they were simply overwhelmed. Wedding planning can do that to anyone. I didn't think much of it until one Tuesday morning, exactly 2 weeks before the ceremony. I was organizing student reports at work when my phone rang. The caller ID displayed one word:
Mom.
She almost never called during my work hours. The moment I answered, I knew something wasn't right. Her voice sounded careful. Too careful. "Mira," she said quietly, "I need to tell you something." My stomach tightened. What happened? There was a pause, long enough for every possible disaster to race through my mind. Then she finally spoke. "Hannah won't be the flower girl anymore." The room around me seemed to disappear. I stared silently through my office window, convinced I had misunderstood. "What do you mean?" Mom sighed. "There have been changes." "What changes?" "I can't explain everything over the phone." "No," I interrupted. "You can explain why my daughter suddenly isn't in the wedding anymore." Another silence. Then she said something that made even less sense. "It's for the best." "For whose best?" "I don't want this to become an argument." My voice became sharper. "It already is one." She refused to answer. Instead, she repeated the same sentence. "Please don't make this harder than it has to be." Before I could respond, she ended the call. I immediately called Emily. No answer. I called again, straight to voicemail. I texted her. No response. Then I called Daniel. He answered after several rings. His voice sounded exhausted. "Mira?" "Daniel, what is happening?" Another uncomfortable pause. "I think you should talk to Emily." "I've been trying." "I know. Then tell me why Hannah was removed." He lowered his voice. "I'm sorry." "Sorry for what?" "I really can't explain." Then he apologized again. Not because Hannah had done something wrong. Not because plans had changed. Simply because he couldn't tell me the truth. That frightened me far more than if he had argued with me. Something was happening behind the scenes. Something nobody wanted to say out loud. That evening, I drove straight to Emily's house. Her car sat in the driveway. Lights were on inside. I knocked. Nothing. I knocked again. Still nothing. Finally, I heard footsteps approaching the front door. For one hopeful second, I thought she was finally going to explain everything. Instead, I heard the deadbolt lock from the inside. She wasn't opening the door. She was making sure I couldn't. I stood there for nearly a minute before quietly walking back to my car. The drive home felt much longer than usual. I kept rehearsing possible explanations. Had Hannah accidentally offended someone? Had the wedding plans changed completely? Was there some misunderstanding nobody had bothered to explain? None of those possibilities made sense. When I arrived home, Hannah was sitting at the dining table coloring pictures of flowers. She looked up and smiled. "Did Aunt Emily call?" I forced myself to smile back. "Not today." She nodded. "That's okay." Then she returned to coloring tiny white petals onto another wedding picture she planned to give Emily on the wedding morning. I watched her for several seconds before quietly walking into the kitchen. I didn't know how to tell her. And deep down, I wasn't ready to believe it myself. But within 24 hours, I would discover that this wasn't simply a family misunderstanding. Someone had quietly placed a price on my daughter's place in the wedding. And the people I trusted most had already accepted the deal. I wish I could tell you that the truth came quickly. It didn't. For 3 long days, every answer only created another question. The morning after Mom's phone call, I finally sat Hannah down at our kitchen table. She had already noticed something was wrong. Children always do. She looked at me with those calm brown eyes that had inherited so much from her father. "Mom," she asked quietly, "did Aunt Emily change her mind?" There was no gentle way to answer. I reached across the table and held her small hand. "Sweetheart, Aunt Emily had to make a change." She stared at me for several seconds. "So, I'm not the flower girl anymore?" I nodded. Her lips pressed together, but she didn't cry. Not immediately. She simply whispered one question that shattered me. "Did I do something bad?"
No.
"Was I too slow when I practiced?"
No.
Did I ruin the dress? No, Hannah. Then why? I opened my mouth. Nothing came out, because I honestly didn't know. She slowly slid off her chair, walked upstairs, and closed her bedroom door without another word. An hour later, I found the flower girl dress folded perfectly inside its garment bag. The shoes sat neatly beside it. The little basket of flower petals rested on top, as if she were quietly returning a job she believed she had failed. That image stayed in my mind all day. By Friday afternoon, I decided waiting for answers was no longer an option. I drove to the hotel where Daniel's family had reserved several rooms for wedding guests arriving early. I texted Daniel asking if we could speak. To my surprise, he replied within minutes. We met in the hotel lobby cafe. He looked exhausted. Dark circles rested beneath his eyes. His tie was loose, and he kept checking over his shoulder as though someone might overhear us. I'm glad you came, I said. I don't know if I should have. Then start with something simple. I leaned forward. Did Hannah do anything wrong? He answered immediately. No. Did Emily decide this herself? He hesitated. Not exactly. That was the first real answer anyone had given me. What does that mean? Daniel rubbed both hands together. You know my Aunt Eleanor. I knew of her. Everyone did. She was the oldest sister of Daniel's late father and one of the wealthiest members of their extended family. She owned several luxury hotels, funded charity galas, and appeared in local business magazines often enough that strangers recognized her in restaurants. She also had a reputation for believing every problem could be solved with money. What about her? I asked. Daniel looked toward the entrance before lowering his voice. She became heavily involved after offering to help pay for the wedding. How much? Almost $10,000. I blinked. Emily and Daniel had been carefully budgeting every expense. An unexpected contribution that large would have changed everything. But why would that affect Hannah? Daniel looked genuinely uncomfortable. It wasn't exactly a gift. I waited. He finally continued. Aunt Eleanor wanted something in return. I already hated where the conversation was going. What? He swallowed hard. She wanted her granddaughter, Sophie, to become the flower girl. I stared at him. You're telling me my daughter was replaced because someone else paid for the position? He quickly shook his head. It's more complicated. Then explain it. Daniel sighed deeply. My aunt is hosting several investors during the wedding weekend. So, she wanted formal family photographs. I still don't understand. She believes photographs shape public image. He sounded embarrassed even saying the words. She wanted her own granddaughter standing closest to the bride in every major picture. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it sounded too ridiculous to be real. You're serious? He nodded. She kept saying those photos would appear in future charity presentations and family publications. So she bought the role. Daniel closed his eyes. I argued with her. What did Emily say? She refused at first. Hope flickered inside me. And then, my aunt threatened to withdraw every dollar she had promised. Silence settled between us. I slowly leaned back in my chair. So, Emily chose the money. No. Daniel answered so quickly that I looked at him again. She cried for almost 2 days. Then why? He hesitated once more. Your mother convinced her. The words landed harder than I expected. My mother? Daniel nodded. She kept telling Emily that one little wedding roll wasn't worth risking the budget. I looked down at my untouched coffee. One little roll. That was how they described months of excitement. Months of promises. Months of trust. Reduced to a line item in a wedding budget. What exactly did Mom say? Daniel answered carefully. She told Emily that children forget these things. I almost interrupted. But he wasn't finished. She also said family harmony was more important than one disappointed little girl. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My own mother, the same woman who had spent years telling us that character mattered more than money. The same woman who lectured Emily and me about honesty every time we were children. Now she had defended breaking a promise to her own granddaughter. I finally looked back at Daniel. Why are you telling me this? He sighed. Because I couldn't sleep.
What?
I keep thinking about Hannah. His voice cracked slightly. She never complained. He looked away. She just smiled every time she practiced. For the first time since this nightmare began, I believed someone besides me actually understood what had been lost. I need you to answer one more question. He nodded. Did Aunt Eleanor ever speak to Hannah? No. Did Sophie even ask to become Flower Girl?
No.
So, whose idea was this? Daniel didn't hesitate. My aunt's. I sat quietly for several moments. Then something occurred to me. If this was only about family photographs. Daniel looked confused. Why has everyone been acting like they're hiding something much bigger? He frowned. I don't know. You honestly don't? I swear. His answer sounded sincere, which somehow made everything even stranger. Because if even Daniel didn't know the whole story, then Aunt Eleanor's demand probably wasn't the entire truth. After leaving the hotel, I drove home through downtown Portland without turning on the radio. Traffic crawled slowly beneath gray afternoon skies. My thoughts kept replaying every conversation from the past week. Mom's nervous voice. Emily refusing to answer the door. Daniel apologizing over and over. None of it matched the explanation I had just heard. Something still felt incomplete. That evening, Hannah sat beside me on the living room floor drawing another picture. This time, there were no flowers. Only our little family.
Me.
Her. And her father. No wedding. No Aunt Emily. No basket.
No dress.
Just the three of us. She quietly held up the picture. I miss Dad. I know. He would have told me the truth. I felt my throat tighten. Yes. He always did. That night, after Hannah had gone to bed, I stared at my phone for nearly an hour. Finally, I made one decision. I wasn't going to argue. I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't even going to confront Aunt Eleanor. Not yet. If someone had really exchanged my daughter's place in the wedding for $10,000, I wanted proof. Real proof. Because once I found it, no one would ever be able to hide behind excuses again. For the next 2 days, I stopped asking questions. Instead, I started paying attention. People reveal far more when they believe you've already given up. Emily never returned my calls. Mom sent short text messages asking if Hannah was doing okay, but she never mentioned the wedding again. Daniel only sent one message. I'm sorry, nothing more. By Monday morning, I had returned to work, trying to focus on my students. During recess, while supervising children on the playground, I watched 2 girls argue over whose turn it was to use the swings. One little girl finally stepped aside. The other immediately invited her back. We can take turns, she said. The disagreement ended in less than a minute. I couldn't help thinking how strange it was that 7-year-olds sometimes handled fairness better than adults. That afternoon, as I packed my bag to leave the school, my phone vibrated. The caller ID displayed an unfamiliar number. Normally, I ignored unknown calls. For some reason, I answered. Hello. A woman spoke quietly. Is this Mira Zhang? Yes. My name is Vanessa Collins. I didn't recognize it. I'm the wedding planner for Emily and Daniel. I stood still. I know this is unusual, she continued, but I think we should meet. My heart immediately sped up. Why? There was a pause. Because I don't believe anyone has told you the whole truth. 30 minutes later, we met inside a quiet coffee shop several blocks from the wedding venue. Vanessa looked to be in her early 40s, dressed professionally, but noticeably tired. She placed her phone face down on the table before speaking. I've planned weddings for almost 15 years, she began. I've dealt with demanding families, impossible schedules, and unrealistic expectations. She gave a tired smile. But I've never seen anything like this. I leaned forward. What happened? She took a slow breath. Your daughter wasn't the only person Aunt Eleanor tried to replace. That sentence caught me completely off guard. What do you mean? Vanessa reached into a leather folder and removed several printed seating charts. Each version had handwritten notes in bright red ink. This was the original seating arrangement. She pointed to one page. Then Eleanor submitted revisions. Another page. And another. Then another. Every revision moved guests around. At first, I didn't understand the pattern. Then I noticed something. Daniel's relatives had gradually been moved farther from the front. Several elderly family members were relocated toward the back of the ballroom. Close friends disappeared from the head tables. Instead, unfamiliar names filled the premium seats.
Who are these people? I asked.
Business associates. She answered without hesitation. Investors. I stared at the pages. She replaced family with clients? Vanessa nodded. And she insisted the photographers prioritize certain guests. My stomach tightened. Why? Image. That word again. Always image. Vanessa continued. She repeatedly used that word. She opened her folder once more. This time she removed copies of emails. Some were from Emily. Some from Daniel. Most came directly from Eleanor. One email immediately caught my attention. The subject line read, "Final photo priorities." Vanessa quietly slid it toward me. I read every word. The instructions weren't about capturing memories. They were about controlling appearances. Specific relatives were listed. Certain combinations of people were requested. Others were intentionally excluded. One sentence stood out above all the others. Children who are not part of the Brooks family should not appear in primary ceremonial portraits. I looked up slowly. Hannah. Vanessa nodded. Yes. So, it wasn't just about Sophie becoming Flower Girl.
No.
It was about removing Hannah completely. Vanessa folded her hands. I believe so. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, I asked the question that had been growing inside my mind. Did Emily know about these emails? Vanessa hesitated. Some. Not all.
No.
What do you mean? Eleanor often contacted vendors directly. That surprised me. Without telling the bride? Yes. Is that even allowed? Vanessa sighed. It shouldn't happen. She looked genuinely frustrated. I kept redirecting decisions back to Emily whenever I could. So, why didn't you tell her everything? Her expression changed. I tried. What happened? Eleanor always reached her first. Vanessa lowered her voice. Every concern I raised somehow disappeared before it reached Emily. The realization sent a chill through me. Someone had been controlling information from the beginning. Who? Vanessa looked directly into my eyes. I don't know. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she reached into her folder one final time. I wasn't sure whether I should show you this. She placed a small digital voice recorder onto the table. My eyes widened. What is that? A backup. Backup for what? I record planning meetings whenever clients approve major contract changes. She quickly clarified. Not secretly. They all signed consent forms months ago. I picked up the recorder carefully. You recorded Eleanor? One meeting. What happened? Vanessa pressed the play button. The room filled with voices. Paper shuffled. Someone discussed catering. Another person mentioned photography. Then Eleanor's voice became clear. Confident.
Come.
Completely certain of herself. I'm investing almost $10,000. A few seconds passed. I expect the wedding to reflect my family's standing. Someone quietly asked what she meant. Eleanor answered without hesitation. I don't spend that kind of money unless I control the final picture. The recording ended. Silence filled the coffee shop. I slowly placed the recorder back onto the table. There it was. Not gossip. Not assumptions. Not family rumors. Her own words. I don't spend that kind of money unless I control the final picture. Vanessa watched my reaction carefully. I thought you deserved to know. I nodded slowly. Thank you. She looked relieved. But then she added something I wasn't expecting. Mira? Yes. If you expose this before the wedding. She glanced toward the venue across the street. Emily's entire day will collapse. I already knew she was right. The recording could destroy the ceremony before it even happened. Guests would leave. Families would split apart. The wedding itself would become a public disaster. No matter how angry I felt, Emily was still my sister. She had made a terrible decision. But she wasn't the one who had started all of this. I slipped the copied emails back into their envelope. I won't ruin the ceremony. Vanessa looked surprised. You won't. I shook my head.
No.
Then what are you going to do? I looked through the cafe window toward the hotel, where wedding guests continued arriving with smiles and suitcases. They wanted to control the picture. I stood up and placed the recorder carefully into my purse. So, I'll wait until everyone is looking at one. Vanessa slowly smiled. For the first time in days, I wasn't reacting anymore. I was planning. And, before the wedding reception was over, the perfect image Eleanor had spent $10,000 trying to create would become the very thing that exposed her. Wedding morning arrived with clear skies and unusually cool air. From the outside, everything looked exactly the way weddings are supposed to look. Fresh flowers lined the entrance of the historic chapel. Guests smiled as they greeted one another. Music floated softly through the courtyard. Professional photographers moved from one group to another, capturing what looked like perfect memories. No one could have guessed how much tension was hiding beneath those smiles. Hannah stayed home with my close friend, Rachel. I couldn't bring myself to let her watch another little girl carry the basket that had once belonged to her. Before I left the house, she hugged me tightly. Tell Aunt Emily I hope she has a nice wedding. I kissed the top of her head. I will. She never asked why she wasn't invited. She had stopped asking days earlier. That hurt more than any tears ever could. When I arrived at the chapel, several relatives greeted me politely. Some avoided eye contact. Others looked uncomfortable. News travels quickly inside families. Everyone knew something had happened. Almost no one knew what. Mom approached me first. She looked elegant in a navy blue dress, but her smile disappeared the moment she reached me. I'm glad you came, she said carefully. I came because Emily is still my sister. She nodded. Neither of us mentioned Hannah. Neither of us mentioned the phone call. The silence between us carried everything we refused to say. Inside the bridal suite, Emily stood in front of a large mirror while her bridesmaids adjusted the final details of her dress. She looked beautiful. She also looked exhausted. When everyone else stepped outside for a few minutes, we finally stood alone together. She turned toward me slowly. I'm sorry. Those were the first words she had spoken to me in nearly a week. I looked at her for several seconds. Are you sorry because you hurt Hannah? She lowered her eyes. Yes. Or because you're afraid I'll expose what happened today? She flinched. That answer told me everything. I never wanted this. I know. I kept telling myself it was only one part of the ceremony. I remembered Daniel saying almost the exact same thing. Did you ever tell Hannah yourself? Emily closed her eyes.
No.
Why not? Because I couldn't. Her voice cracked. I knew she'd ask me why. And you didn't have an answer. A tear rolled down her cheek. I hated myself every time I looked at that little dress. For a brief moment, I saw my younger sister again. Not the bride trapped inside impossible decisions. Just Emily. Scared. Ashamed. Confused. I reached over and squeezed her hand. You still have time to make different choices. Before she could answer, someone knocked on the door. It was the photographer. They needed the bride for family portraits. Emily wiped away her tears. I have to go. I nodded. So do I. The ceremony itself passed without interruption. Daniel waited at the altar, smiling despite the obvious exhaustion on his face. Guests stood as Emily entered the chapel. The music began. Flower petals scattered across the aisle. Only they weren't scattered by Hannah. Sophie's parents proudly watched as their daughter walked ahead of the bride. The little girl looked nervous. She wasn't doing anything wrong. She was simply a child caught inside an adult's decision. I refused to blame her. During the vows, I glanced toward the front row. Aunt Eleanor sat perfectly still. Every movement seemed carefully controlled. She smiled at exactly the right moments. She applauded politely. Anyone meeting her for the first time would probably describe her as generous and sophisticated. Appearances really did matter to her. The ceremony ended with applause. Guests congratulated the newly married couple. Photographers immediately gathered relatives for formal portraits outside the chapel. I watched quietly from a distance. Vanessa had been right. The photographers followed Eleanor's instructions almost exactly. Business associates were invited forward before some family members. Certain relatives waited far longer than others. Each arrangement looked strangely deliberate. Then something unexpected happened. One elderly uncle arrived late after getting lost on the drive from the airport. He was Daniel's father's older brother. Instead of welcoming him into the main family portrait, one assistant quietly asked him to wait. "There isn't enough room right now." The old man smiled politely and stepped back without arguing. I watched disappointment flash across his face before he hid it. Daniel noticed. Without saying a word, he walked away from the photographer, crossed the lawn, and personally brought his uncle into the center of the next photograph. Aunt Eleanor frowned immediately. The photographer hesitated. Daniel didn't. "My uncle stays." His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. For the first time all weekend, someone openly ignored Eleanor's quiet control.
She didn't argue.
Not there. Not in front of everyone. But I saw the anger in her expression. It confirmed everything Vanessa had shown me. Hours later, the reception began inside a restored ballroom overlooking the river. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm light across polished wooden floors. A live jazz trio played softly while guests enjoyed dinner. Conversations slowly replaced the tension of the ceremony. Laughter returned. To anyone walking in, it looked like a successful wedding. I knew appearances could be misleading. Throughout dinner, I barely touched my meal. Inside my purse rested copies of Eleanor's emails, the voice recording, every piece of evidence Vanessa had trusted me with. I hadn't decided exactly how to use it. Only when, as dessert plates were cleared away, the master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced cheerfully, "we're now opening the microphone for family tributes." Several people shared warm stories. Emily's college roommate spoke first. Daniel's best friend followed. Everyone laughed. Everyone applauded. Then the host smiled toward my table. "And now, we'd like to invite the bride's sister, Mira Zhang." The ballroom grew quiet. I slowly stood. Every heartbeat felt louder than the music. I picked up a simple white envelope before walking toward the stage. Mom watched me with growing concern. Emily looked nervous. Daniel straightened in his chair. Across the room, Aunt Eleanor smiled confidently. She believed she already knew exactly how this evening would end. She had no idea that the next few minutes would destroy the perfect image she had spent $10,000 trying so hard to create. As I walked toward the stage, dozens of conversations faded into silence. Every pair of eyes followed me. I could feel my mother's anxiety from across the ballroom. Emily's fingers tightened around Daniel's hand. Vanessa stood quietly near the back of the room beside the event staff, watching without saying a word. Only Aunt Eleanor appeared completely relaxed. She smiled politely, lifted her champagne glass, and leaned back in her chair. She thought I was about to give a sentimental wedding toast. For a brief second, I almost wished she were right. I reached the microphone and looked around the room. So many people here traveled a long way to celebrate Emily and Daniel. Several guests smiled. I've spent the past few days thinking about what family really means. The room remained quiet. When we hear the word family, we usually think about love. I paused. We think about loyalty. Another pause. And we think about keeping promises. Emily lowered her head. I wasn't looking at her. I wasn't there to humiliate my sister. I continued. I had planned to tell a story about my daughter, Hannah, and how excited she was to be chosen as Flower Girl. A few guests exchanged confused glances. She practiced every evening. I smiled sadly. She even asked me if flower girls were allowed to smile too much. Soft laughter spread through the room. Then it disappeared. Unfortunately, she never had the chance to find out. The silence became heavier. I reached into the white envelope and removed several printed pages. I've learned something important this week. I held the papers up. Sometimes the most beautiful weddings hide decisions that no child should ever have to experience. Mom slowly covered her mouth. Across the ballroom, Aunt Eleanor's smile finally disappeared. She sat upright. I wasn't accusing anyone. Not yet. Instead, I turned toward Vanessa. Before I continue, I'd like to thank someone. The wedding planner looked surprised. Vanessa Collins has worked incredibly hard to make this wedding happen despite impossible circumstances. Guests applauded politely. Vanessa looked both grateful and nervous. I smiled at her before turning back toward the audience. She reminded me that transparency matters. I nodded toward the projection screen behind me. I asked permission to share a few behind-the-scenes moments from the planning process. The master of ceremonies looked confused. He glanced toward the audiovisual technician. Vanessa quietly gave him a small nod. The slideshow began. At first, everyone relaxed. Photos of cake tastings appeared, dress fittings, venue tours, menu samples. Guests laughed as Emily accidentally tasted frosting with a plastic spoon upside down. Even Emily smiled. Everything looked perfectly ordinary. Then the images changed. The next slide displayed a screenshot of an email. No names were highlighted. No dramatic music played. Just simple black text on a white background. The room grew quiet as guests began reading. Please prioritize Brooke's family members in ceremonial portraits. Another slide appeared. Children outside the Brooks family should not appear in primary photographs. Several people frowned. Whispers spread from table to table. Then came another email. Please move business guests closer to the bride and groom during formal seating. The ballroom became noticeably quieter. I still hadn't said a single accusation. The documents were speaking for themselves. Aunt Eleanor suddenly stood. This is inappropriate. Her voice echoed through the room. She looked toward the projection booth. Turn that off. Nobody moved. Instead, Daniel slowly stood beside his chair. No. His answer was calm, firm, final. Eleanor stared at him in disbelief. What did you say? I said no. Daniel looked toward the technician. Keep going. Another document appeared. This one contained handwritten notes requesting last-minute changes to family portraits. Specific relatives had been crossed out. Others had been added. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Business first. Family second. Image above everything. Guests were no longer whispering. They were openly talking. Confusion spread across the ballroom. Some looked shocked. Others looked embarrassed. Then I reached into my purse. I have one final thing. I held up the small digital recorder. This recording comes from a planning meeting attended by the wedding vendors. Aunt Eleanor's expression changed immediately. You cannot play that. Vanessa spoke for the first time. Every participant consented to recorded planning meetings. The room became completely silent. I pressed the button. The recording began. Papers shuffled. Voices discussed schedules. Someone mentioned photography. Then Eleanor's voice filled every speaker in the ballroom. I'm investing almost $10,000. A brief pause. I expect the wedding to reflect my family standing. Another voice quietly asked what she meant. Without hesitation, Eleanor answered. I don't spend that kind of money unless I control the final picture. The recording ended. No one spoke. Not immediately. The silence felt endless. Emily slowly turned toward Aunt Eleanor. Tears filled her eyes. You told me it was only about helping us. Eleanor folded her arms. It was. Emily shook her head.
No.
Her voice broke. You bought control. Daniel looked at his aunt with obvious disappointment. You manipulated us. Mom remained frozen in her chair. She couldn't look at me. She couldn't look at Emily. She simply stared down at the tablecloth. Then something happened that none of us had expected. One of the guests near the front quietly stood. He was an older gentleman I had never met before. His silver name badge identified him as one of the investors Eleanor had invited. He adjusted his jacket before speaking. My name is Richard Hale. Every conversation stopped. He looked directly at Eleanor. My foundation supports children's education programs across the Pacific Northwest. Eleanor forced an uncomfortable smile. Richard, perhaps we should discuss this privately. He ignored her. I was considering inviting you to join our advisory board next year. The room remained silent. Richard looked around the ballroom before continuing. I believed your public reputation reflected your private character.
He paused.
I was mistaken. Eleanor's confidence finally cracked. This has been taken completely out of context. Richard calmly shook his head.
No.
He looked toward the projector screen. I've seen the emails. Then he looked toward the recorder still resting in my hand. And I've heard your own words. He took a slow breath. Any adult willing to push aside a 7-year-old child simply to improve photographs does not represent the values our foundation exists to protect. Several guests quietly applauded. Others nodded. The applause slowly grew louder. Not for me, not against Eleanor, but for the truth finally being impossible to hide. For the first time that evening, Aunt Eleanor looked completely alone. The image she had spent $10,000 trying to create had collapsed in front of everyone. And the night still wasn't over. The applause slowly faded. No one rushed to speak. No one hurried back to eating dessert. It was as if the entire ballroom needed a few moments to understand what had just happened. Aunt Eleanor remained standing beside her table. For someone who had spent years controlling every room she entered, she suddenly looked completely out of place. She glanced around, searching for someone to defend her. No one did. Not even the relatives who had always admired her wealth. Daniel broke the silence first. He walked toward his aunt until they stood only a few feet apart. I trusted you. His voice remained steady. You told us your contribution was a wedding gift. Eleanor straightened her shoulders. It was. Daniel shook his head. A gift doesn't come with hidden conditions. She tried again. I was only trying to protect our family's image. Daniel answered immediately. You nearly destroyed it. Emily slowly stood. Her wedding dress brushed softly across the wooden floor as she crossed the room toward me. For a second, I wasn't sure what she was going to do. Then she stopped in front of me. Her eyes were red from crying. I'm so sorry. This time, the apology sounded different. There were no excuses. No explanations. No one else speaking for her. Only regret. I should have protected Hannah. I looked at my little sister. You should have. She nodded. I kept telling myself I would fix it later. A tear rolled down her cheek. But later never came. I reached out and hugged her. Not because everything was suddenly okay. It wasn't. But because healing has to begin somewhere. When we stepped apart, Emily turned toward the guests. I need everyone here to know something. She took a deep breath. The money Aunt Eleanor gave us will be returned. A quiet murmur spread across the ballroom. Emily continued. I don't care if Daniel and I have to postpone our honeymoon. She looked at her husband. We'll pay every dollar back ourselves. Daniel walked beside her. We both agree. He placed an arm around Emily's shoulders. Our marriage shouldn't begin with a debt created by hurting a child. For the first time that evening, genuine smiles appeared across several tables. Even Richard Hale nodded with quiet approval. Aunt Eleanor opened her mouth to protest. You don't have to. Daniel interrupted. Yes, we do. There was no anger in his voice anymore. Only certainty. Eleanor looked around one last time. No one supported her. Without another word, she picked up her purse and walked toward the ballroom exit. No one tried to stop her. The heavy doors closed behind her. She left the wedding alone. As soon as she disappeared, the atmosphere inside the ballroom changed. People started talking again. Not with gossip. With relief. It felt as though everyone had been holding their breath for days. Mom remained seated. She hadn't moved. Finally, she looked at me. Mira? I walked over. She stood slowly. I failed Hannah. Those 3 words sounded heavier than everything else she had said all week. You did. She nodded. I thought I was protecting Emily. You were protecting the wedding. She lowered her head. And I forgot who needed protecting most. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she quietly asked, Do you think Hannah will ever forgive me? I answered honestly. I don't know. She accepted the answer, without arguing. The reception continued, although nothing felt quite the same. The expensive decorations, the elegant centerpieces, the polished speeches, none of them seemed nearly as important anymore. Later that evening, I left before the dancing began. I wanted to go home. When I opened my front door, Hannah came running down the hallway wearing her pajamas. She smiled the moment she saw me. How was the wedding? I knelt to hug her. It was unforgettable. She studied my face carefully. Did Aunt Emily get married? Yes. Was she happy? I thought about everything that had happened. By the end of the night, I think she finally understood what really mattered. Hannah nodded. Then she disappeared into her bedroom for a moment before returning with something in her hands. It was the small flower basket she had practiced with for months. She held it out toward me. Can we give this to Aunt Emily? I blinked. You still want her to have it? She smiled. I don't need it anymore. There wasn't any anger in her voice. No bitterness. Just kindness. The kind that adults often spend their entire lives trying to learn. The next afternoon, Emily came to our house. She wasn't wearing her wedding dress anymore. She was simply my little sister again. The moment Hannah opened the door, Emily knelt down until they were face to face. I'm sorry I broke my promise. Hannah quietly handed her the basket. I know. Emily's eyes filled with tears. I'll never do that again. Hannah hugged her without saying another word. Some relationships don't heal because people forget. They heal because someone finally chooses to change. Over the following months, Emily and Daniel mailed Aunt Eleanor a cashier's check for every dollar she had contributed. She returned it twice. They mailed it back twice. Eventually, she accepted it. Richard Hale never invited Eleanor onto his foundation's advisory board. Instead, his organization partnered with Daniel's Community Youth Center, funding after-school programs for children whose families couldn't afford tutoring. Vanessa's honesty unexpectedly helped her business. Several guests who witnessed the reception later hired her to plan their own events because they trusted her integrity. As for my mother, she didn't try to earn Hannah's forgiveness with expensive gifts. She earned it one afternoon at a time. She attended school plays. She helped with homework. She never missed another birthday. Slowly, trust began returning. Not because anyone demanded forgiveness, because consistent actions replaced empty words. As for Aunt Eleanor, the reputation she had spent decades building quietly unraveled. Not through rumors, not through revenge, through her own emails, her own recording, her own decisions. Several charitable organizations distanced themselves from her after word spread among community leaders about what had happened. The photographs she had tried so desperately to control became meaningless. People remembered the story behind them instead. Looking back now, I don't think this was ever really about a flower girl. It was about a promise. A child believed the adults around her would keep their word. Most of them didn't. But eventually, the truth mattered more than appearances. Money mattered less than character. And family finally remembered that love isn't measured by the size of a donation. It's measured by the promises you're willing to keep when breaking them would be easier. If this story touched you, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss future stories about family, betrayal, justice, and second chances. Thank you so much for spending your time with me. I'll see you in the next story.